Okay, while we're waiting for Deuce to come back, let's talk about what we are going to talk about today. Put this on mute. Okay, I think we got just about all of our audio issues resolved here. So, first off, I want to welcome you all to XVOA. Today, we are asking a question. This is a question politics keeps trying to avoid, right? That question is, do we need our allies to love us? Or do we need them to help move the machinery? And, we accuse MAGA, right, of making politics emotional, tribal, and performative. But do we sometimes do our own version of that? That's the question today. Let's see if we can bring in our guest, Deuce.
How's it going?
All right, good, good, good. We got the audio problems worked out. This is my guest today, by the way, Duece Davis. Many of you may know him formally as Steward Beckham, but he has been one of the persistent critics of the Bulwark from inside the broader anti-Trump conversation. And I don't want to caricature his argument before he's even given, before I've even given him a chance to speak. And but I also want to test my own premise here too. And listen, this show isn't really about whether the Bulwark is good or bad. Okay, that's a uh, this is about political realism. It's about purity versus power. It is about whether the Bulwark is a useful tool against Trumpism or whether its usefulness has made it even more dangerous as a narrator of the coalition. So I'm going to bring in Deuce. He can introduce himself and correct me if I've made any wrong surface premises here before we get started. And then we're going to have a visual presentation. We're going to talk about some clips, some quotes. I'm going to bring up some examples of, um, I guess, uh, bulwark examples from the past. And, I'm going to kind of demonstrate how they've been useful as a tool in the, I guess, progress towards civil rights. But Deuce, let me go ahead and let you talk, man.
It's good to see you again.
Thanks.
Thank you for having me on your show again, and thank you for following and being very supportive of just this perspective, the work that we're doing. Me and my co-host Evan Stern, he is the writer of Certain Thoughts Substack, and we are working on a show called Reality Checking the Bulwark, where
Okay.
we basically start from the premise that the Bulwark is working in good faith, just with some limitations, but also with understanding the narrative power that it has over the larger pro democracy conversation amongst the center right, the and center left, and the far left and far right. And it's not very foreign or not very unfamiliar to many who are in the space of political discussion or media analysis to know that the media amplifies people and ideas over others. And sometimes that amplification process can mischaracterize people's positions or mischaracterize the way people are essentially making their argument about their human rights or about their personal perspective. So we try to look at the Bulwark from a structural point of view on whether they are simply representing conservatives who don't like Trump and are still trying to understand how the conservative movement and the history of American conservatism led to Trump, compared to how they may become the main voice in enacting Democratic strategy and influencing Democratic power brokers to prioritize one set of voters over another. So I would actually probably challenge your premise that this is a purity test, or that we're interested in purity tests. And I would likely try to say that we're actually looking for accountability, and whether the narrative that the Bulwark and kind of the Nicole Wallace universe of Bush neocons on MS Now kind of amplify about the progressive left, about the motivations of Trump voters, about their ability of them to be won over, and about the general political landscape, and how they have on record a poor track record of being able to successfully make sure that Trump or Trumpism is not politically popular within our country, or even politically successful as we see today.
Okay. Well, before we get to Tim Miller, you sent me some clips. We're going to try and play some of those clips. And before we get to Sarah Longwell, before we get to Charlie Sykes, we need to start where XVOA always starts, and that's with memory. Because, listen, Black political history has rarely given us clean tools. So, for the first clip that I'm going to make for my argument, I'm going to play a PBS 1876 reconstruction clip from the PBS documentary of the same name, 1876 Reconstruction. Okay. We're going to go straight to Sherman. All right. Black leaders in Georgia, field order number 15, 40 acres and a mule. Okay, let's see if we can get that clip played here.
On January 11th, President Lincoln sent his Secretary of War, Edwin M. Stanton, to Savannah. Stanton instructed General Sherman to set up a meeting with some of the city's black ministers. He wanted to hear how the freedmen imagined their future in the South. That evening, 20 black men entered the grand parlor as guests of Stanton and Sherman. 16 were former slaves. They chose Reverend Garrison Frazier, who had purchased his freedom 9 years earlier, to be their spokesman. For the first time, federal officials conferred with freed slaves about the future of African Americans in the South.
The exchange that occurs between Sherman, Stanton, and the Union generals and Reverend Frazier is one of the extraordinary moments of the Civil War and the ending of the Civil War. Because they asked Frazier not just what should we do with all these refugees, they asked him questions about what the war meant. They asked him questions about what the Emancipation Proclamation had meant. They asked him what the presence of black troops in the Union Army meant. And in many ways, you'll find no better definition of the meaning of the Civil War and the kinds of answers that Garrison Frazier gives that day in Savannah.
The freedom, as I understand it, promised by the Emancipation Proclamation, is taking us from under the yoke of bondage and placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor.
To be a slave, as one of these ministers pointed out to General Sherman, was to be someone who had no control over his life's decisions. And now, these people feel the need to express their abilities, their choices.
The The way we can best take care of ourselves is to have land, and we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own.
This was a man who never left probably coastal Georgia in his life. But he understood the Declaration of Independence. He understood the Emancipation Proclamation. And beyond that, he said, in effect, you should give us our rights, and you should protect our rights, and then you should leave us alone and let us be citizens.
4 days later, anxious to get thousands of freed slaves off his hands and Washington off his back, General Sherman issued Special Field Order 15. It was only a temporary order, but it became one of the most controversial of the Civil War. Plantations in the rice country had been abandoned by white planters during the war. 400,000 of these acres would be given over to African Americans for settlement.
Okay, listen, the Sherman was not Frederick Douglass. I understand that. By the way, Deuce, were you able to hear the audio from that presentation?
I was, yes.
Okay,
So
good,
thank
good.
you.
All right, yeah. As I was saying, Sherman was not a racial saint, but in that moment, Black leaders spoke, power listened, and a military order that we now know as 40 acres and a mule, field order number 15, I believe, a military order moved. And that is the lesson here. That wasn't about love or purity. That was a man who was used as a tool. And there's some very important back history. I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. If you know anything about William Tecumseh Sherman, have read his memoirs, he did not think that Black people were um, um, up to the task. Let me just say it outright. He didn't think that Black people were intelligent enough for self-governance and voting and full participation in democracy. But here he is facilitating the field order number 15, 40 acres in a move, and intricately involved with what we might call the first civil rights initiative. All of these Black religious leaders coming together to determine the direction of freedmen for the next 100 years or so. So, Deuce, when you look at Sherman in this frame, do you see a model here for using compromised power? Or do you think that analogy fails when applied to modern anti-Trump conservatives? And hold it, before you answer that question, I was about to say that part of the history there they didn't go into was the major reason that this push that there was this push from Lincoln and the Secretary of Defense was because of a major embarrassment for the United States Army was the Ebenezer Creek Massacre. This was a major embarrassment at the time where a General Jackson, was it General Jackson, I believe, who gave the order to pull up bridges that pontoon bridges that the United States Army was using to cross Ebenezer Creek. There was a whole bunch of freed slaves who had accompanied the soldiers as they crisscrossed the landscape, and they were becoming a problem. So they intentionally pulled up the bridge when the last Union soldier crossed and left the stragglers to face the Confederate soldiers who were coming at them from the rear. So thousands of lives were lost in that creek. So this was a response to that. So let me give you a chance to answer my question, Deuce.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing in the historical analogy there. I think it's deeply important to understand today. So, kind of answering your first question, yes, the frame is important. The thing to remember about the Civil War era and the immediate preceding era is that the tangible wins that were happening at that time were in response to the bloodletting of the country. So for about 40 years before the Civil War, the Congress had been operating under essentially a muzzle policy around not being able to talk about slavery in the halls of Congress. And that made it so that the abolitionist movement was radicalized outside of the halls of power into trying to spread their message in ways that they know their political leaders would legally be tied to not talking about. And again, that influenced the worldview and memory of Sherman, of course. But in the years of the Civil War, he was forced to see the devastation that was wrought on not only the Union men who were sent south to fight in the war, but also the people who had farms or were living in the South who now saw their surroundings burned and forced into chaos because an entire war had broken out by not having this conversation about the compromise, the 3/5 compromise, and the compromise to keep slavery alive that defines the American independence movement. And so the Field Order 15 is a tangible movement towards equality, whether Sherman was forced by historical circumstance or he personally believed it. The country had degraded and fallen to the point where he, as a racist himself, especially by today's standards, was forced to move in that direction. And you can see that framework being pushed all the way into the current political environment with the way that Mitt Romney marched with the Black Lives Matters movement during 2020. However, the argument that I would make about why the Bulwark, based on evidence analysis and criticisms, don't fall within that framework is that they're not really supporting any movement forward that would acknowledge the way the institutions disenfranchised and hollowed out working Americans to the point where they are in favor of demagoguery, or they also are not in favor of policy reforms that also acknowledge those institutional failures. And I think a recent example, which I posted a clip of, I don't think I sent it with you with the package of clips, but Sarah Longwell and Jonathan V. Lass were arguing about Supreme Court expansion. And their conversations are very important to follow because Sarah Longwell is the managing editor and founder, maybe former managing editor because Sam Stein's the managing editor, but she is the founder of the Bulwark through her firm, Longwell Partners, which Ryan Grimm, notable journalist at Dropsite, independent journalist, basically revealed that they receive money from the Koch Foundation, which is a very notable, pro-corporate, usually supporting right-wing policies in the Democratic and Republican Party funder. And so her role has been
when you mentioned the Koch brothers, the Koch, I have flashbacks of the early 2000s, right? They were heavily involved with the Bush administration. Am I correct?
Yes. And there are different Cokes. So I think David Koch is like the more at least climate friendly one, in the more like moderate sense about acknowledging climate change, where I think Charles, if he's still alive, is the more right wing about culture, environmental, and general like policy around economic development and what in taxes. But what I was trying to say is again, Sarah Longwell comes from that Bush Republican world. And so the fact that she accepts money from the Koch brothers as the founder of the Bulwark and Longwell Partners means that she is in an incentive structure that is tied to not acknowledging a certain level of institutional complicity when it comes to how the political center of the past brought us Trumpism. Really, that comes down to how the Democratic Party moved right and the Republican Party moved to the far right. And then Jonathan V. Last is the executive editor, so he has a lot of control over the content. So when they talk, they have a secret podcast every Friday. It's a very important conversation because it really shows you about the culture and the editorial direction of the Bulwark. And Jonathan V. Last has come out in favor of court expansion and is trying to put Sarah Longwell on the boat of court expansion with her. And she thinks that that is a policy that is just made out of rage and irrational left-wing hopes and dreams. Again, that might be coming from her just being institutionally formed in an era of supreme right-wing propaganda. And she's even admitted that, her view of the American military came from a Hollywood movie in the 1980s. But again, if you're not going to be in favor of the institutional reforms that actually are required in order to rebuild the Voting Rights Act and not just make sure that a radical activist, right-wing activist court basically shuts down for the next generation or two any kind of legislative or even executive reform to restore voting rights or to secure the right to love and the right to marriage or to make sure that women have the right to their own health care, then you are pretty much only performatively against Trump, or you are more interested in creating a status quo that worked for you personally, but is not working for the people who remember how bad it was before and after Trump and don't have the same kind of baggage that doesn't allow them to draw the through line between the excesses of neoconservatism and neoliberalism and how that created, supported, abetted, and empowered Trump in the first place.
Okay. Now, forgive me if I might have missed it from the beginning, but you have a particular background with the Bulwark. And let me make sure I don't make any misstatements, but you were employed either directly by the Bulwark or with a media organization that worked for the Bulwark. Is that correct?
No.
Okay.
I would like to first point out, because that is a good question. I'm seeing in the chat that there's an echo. Do you?
Okay. Yeah, let me fix that.
I have my headphones in, so I'm.
I think I may have to go in and out of my microphone. Okay. All right, go ahead.
Okay. I think it's better. People in the chat, please let us know if it's okay. Yep, we're being told it's good. Shout out to Evan. He's in the chat. He's the co-host of Reality Checking the Bulwark. So yes, I do not have a history with the Bulwark. I essentially I was very intrigued by their work. So I got my master's degree at American University in political communications. And this is about 2 years after I graduated from the University of Maryland, studying United States history, specifically propaganda in the Cold War. And so what I studied, I couldn't hear that. What? Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, Deuce. Go ahead. I thought my mic was muted.
Oh, okay. No problem. Thank you. And so when I was in my master's program, I studied the New Right and essentially the formation of the neoconservative coalition from the paleoconservative tradition. And so I came across the Bulwark when they were still the Weekly Standard, and a bunch of Trump-friendly investors pushed the anti-Trump voices out, which included Bill Kristol and Jonathan B. Last. And so then they teamed up with Charlie Sykes to start the Bulwark. And essentially, they kind of got wind of me because I'm this like young Black zillennial who's actually following their content. They're kind of used to like older white center left, center right people who read their kind of stuff. And so they became intrigued, like, why is this kid following our stuff? Why is he not like listening to like, you know, the Young Turks or like some hyper left wing or even center left, like, you know, crooked media? And why is he talking, like looking at us? And I was clear, and I've actually met some of them through their speaking tours. You know, I was clear to them that I was interested in how the quote unquote purportedly free market oriented, non-racist, non-misogynist, purely Burkean, you know, purely intellectual side of the conservative movement that on paper said they disavowed David Duke and disavowed Pat Buchanan's blood and soil speech at the 1992, you know, Republican convention. You know, they claimed that they were the good conservatives, essentially. So I was really interested in seeing how they reacted to the rise of Trump, who was blatantly running on a blood and soil platform, was blatantly rising on the idea that America was being taken over by, you know, immigrants from the global South who were tarnishing the culture. And that kind of like was just flying in the face of everything they told us conservatism was. So, you know, JVL, he actually has shared some of my articles. He shared the one where I wrote about the miseducation of woke and how basically woke was historically a term used by African Americans to talk about being awake to what it's like to be both Black and an American, both to love America, but also know that it has historically failed us as a race or as a people, and thus failed democracy for all races and all backgrounds. But at the same time, I started moving away from the Bulwark and really seeing them as helpful during the end of the Biden presidency and into the beginning of this new Trump presidency. And so I took a break from writing in June of 2024 because I wanted to see how the Kamala Harris campaign went down. And I watched it closely and saw how the Bulwark influenced the campaign along with other center left and center right consultant class people, influenced the Harris campaign to triangulate so much to the right that she kind of lost her own voice in the process. And then when I saw that happen and she lost, I watched closely to see if the Bulwark would even acknowledge that it probably had a role in not really reading the way Americans were feeling about the world that they believe was noble before Trump, but actually was not as they remember it as white collar elites living in the game of political messaging and policy making. That other, you know, that world for them, that was the status quo that worked for them. But for a lot of people outside of the Beltway, outside of the DC professional class, the neoliberal, neoconservative center was not helping them and did not give them the trickle-down material benefits it had promised them for generations. And so I was waiting to see if the Bulwark would acknowledge any of this lacking of imagination and their role in directing the Harris campaign, even with hosting an event where she went on stage with Liz Cheney, as maybe a reason for them to kind of question their priors or to at least open their staff up to more voices of color, more people who don't come from their conventional world of, you know, very liberal, suburban, white, centrist politics that is their comfort zone. And I noticed they really didn't do that. And instead, they actually took the opposite route and joined a lot of people like Matt Iglesias and Ezra Klein, who a lot of younger, more progressive left intellectuals have aptly named reactionary centrists, in blaming civil rights advocates, blaming trans advocates, blaming pro-Palestinian advocates for that crucial loss in 2024 that has changed the nation forever, instead of looking in the mirror and really saying, maybe our constant project of revitalizing a noble political center that Trump is an aberration of instead of an outcome of turned off a lot of people, and that rubbed onto Kamala, and that is why we lost, because she wasn't more fiercely talking about what it's like to be the first Black and Asian woman, or Black, Caribbean, and Asian woman who is running for president, who's running for president, who to be supportive of Palestinian, of looking at the Palestinian people in a way that humanizes them and not looks at them as just terrorists or those brown people over there. She wasn't really fiercely talking about that, and even told them to kind of calm down or settle down. And so I was just becoming a little bit disenchanted with what I first saw as an intellectually honest, or at least intellectually limited project from people who were formed in the Cold War, who were formed in an America that did not have the diversity it has today, or does not have the self efficating lens that it has today, because it's not living in that post-Cold War triumphalist moment. If I understand their limits there. Again, the limits of being born in the 70s and 80s as kind of like and some of the followers will probably say, well, I was born in the 70s and 80s. I always knew these people were full of crap. But, like coming from a very like bubbled up suburban credentialed professionalized version of America, I accepted those limits. But when those limits now are becoming built into an incentive structure that only serves to caricature progressive movements, people who are under 40, and people who are feeling the material degradation of what normalizing Trump has done, and also what the politics of austerity and deregulation and destroying the social safety net has done to lead us to Trump, then that becomes not really helpful in getting us to a movement towards restoring civil rights and civil liberties, but actually making us narratively crippled, or not giving us the language to really speak about what's hurting us, because we're more interested in trying to say that Trump is not Bush, or Trump is not Obama, or, the way things were done before at least had the allure or the performance of civility, rather than understanding that actually Trump is just taking the mask off and revealing what was already always there.
I could kind of see the direction of the story that you were telling kind of take a right turn, so to speak, when you said the word triangulate. Whenever I hear that word, every time I hear that word, it has to do with policies or a political trajectory that is never good for marginalized people, right? I heard that term a lot during the Clinton administration, triangulation, how he dealt with the Republicans who had controlled Congress at the time. Hearing that, associated with the Kamala Harris campaign, it kind of got me feeling a certain kind of way, and it's got me making connections in my head with the past. And I'm speaking specifically of the Republicans who, during the Civil War, shortly after the Civil War, were, radical. Well, some members of the Republican Party were radical advocates of Black civil rights. Somehow, after 1876, 1880, after that time period became kind of just, I don't know the word to say, um, just nonchalant about black people. In fact, there was a term, the white Republicans was the term that was used for the people that came up in the the political leaders in the Republican Party that came up in the post Reconstruction era, who were wanted to try to lure votes from the Democratic Party in the South. So this is just going to set me up for the next video. I don't want to give away too much, but this right here, it's a fresh perspective with Jeff Charles, entitled "How the Republican Party Lost the Black Vote." This is part 2 of his series. Let's go ahead and play the clip.
Now, we've got FDR, who was also a virulent racist. This guy had a very close relationship with the N-word. I discovered that in my reading. But again, imagine how bad you have to be that black people will vote for a man named FDR, who didn't hide his racism, by the way. He wasn't even really trying to reach out to black voters with a New Deal. But you know who was? His wifey. Eleanor Roosevelt was very good about reaching out to the black community, and also to women as well, because her husband was not interested. But in the lead up to Roosevelt's ascension to power, black Americans were becoming increasingly disenchanted with the Republican Party for the reasons that I just listed off. The Republican presidents who came after Lincoln did very little to continue in the tradition of the party of Lincoln. To make matters worse, the Lily White movement in the South had driven a wedge between the party and its black supporters. President Herbert Hoover, however, despite doing very little to advance black causes, he received about 2/3 to 3/4 of the black vote in 1928. Now, in 1928, this would be the very last time that a Republican president won the majority of black votes. Think about that. In 1928, almost 100 years ago, this was the last time that a Republican president won the majority of black votes. I'm going to quote from a book called The Loneliness of the Black Republican. This was written by Dr. Leah Wright Rigueur. I'm going to be quoting extensively from this book throughout this presentation, and it is in the show notes. I would highly recommend buying this book. You can get it on Kindle. You can get it on Amazon. You can get the hard copy, or you can get it on your Kindle. I have it on my on the Kindle app. Very enlightening book. Very, very enlightening. Very dense. I haven't even quite finished the book yet. And the reason why is because I tend to read fast, but you can't read this book fast because she has so much information in there. And it's so dense that you have to actually read certain paragraphs 2 or 3 times to really grasp what she's talking about. She has tons of different quotes from newspapers, from politicians, and things like that. You need to read this book if you're interested in this topic. So again, I'm going to be quoting from her extensively, and I'm going to be letting you know when it's coming from her book. But here's a quote. A growing number of African Americans argue that since the demise of Reconstruction, Republican presidents had failed, as historian Nancy Weiss describes, to measure up to the legacy of Lincoln. As if the despair and suffering ushered in by the Depression was not enough to question the economic conservatism of Herbert Hoover, the president also displayed a record of disregard and disrespect toward African Americans in his attempt to cultivate lily white republicanism within the South. So the lily white movement didn't end and when FDR came to power. They continued. It had continued under his predecessor, Herbert Hoover. Now, Rigueur continues, Quote, Black leaders debated whether Hoover and the party's decisions came out of complacency, indifference, or a more insidious racism, but the result was clear. Republican leaders neglected both the economic and civil rights needs of Black citizens. The progress of African Americans was as stagnant as the economy, with few victories in the struggle against segregation, discrimination, racial violence, and disenfranchisement. So the Republican Party's refusal to address the needs of Black Americans created an opportunity for the Democrats under a Roosevelt administration that at least paid some lip service to being concerned about the plight of former slaves and their descendants. Now, keep in mind, the New Deal wasn't really intended for Black people. And in the beginning years of it, Black people weren't really able to access the benefits. Not all of them, anyway. I think they were able to access some, but in general, no, not really. And if it weren't for the Lily White movement in the Republican Party, this wouldn't have been good enough for Black people. Now, eventually they were able to access more of those benefits, but at first they were not. Quote from Dr. Leah Wright Rigueur. Thus, while the realignment of the Black electorate between 1932 and 1936 was remarkable, it was not a surprise. Many African Americans were ripe for the courting from a shrewd Democratic presidential incumbent. They also had nothing to lose by leaving the Republican Party, whereas political coalitions with Northern Democrats hinted at the possibility of racial and economic progress. So again, they had nothing to lose by leaving the Republican Party. The Democrat Party basically said what Trump said in 2016. What the hell do you have to lose? Black people said nothing, because Republicans aren't interested. She continues, quote, moreover, the Roosevelt administration was the first administration since Lincoln's to actively minister to the needs of Blacks, though many of the programs were not deliberately targeted at African Americans. So the bottom line is that despite the fact that most of FDR's New Deal programs were not intended for Black Americans, it still benefited them. On the other hand, the Republican Party failed to offer a viable alternative to African Americans, which again is why they had nothing to lose by going with Roosevelt. Now, to sweeten the deal, Roosevelt appointed a Black cabinet. Now, this Black cabinet was staffed with African American advisors who, quote, consulted with various administration agency and program directors. So Roosevelt even makes things better by doing a little bit of pandering. He formed his own Black cabinet. And here's the thing, we might say this is pandering, but this was a serious thing. These people actually did have input as to what went on. Now, while this was going on, African Americans started seeing that their fortunes were increasing. And a higher percentage of Black people felt comfortable supporting Roosevelt. In 1936, get this, in 1936, Franklin Delano Roosevelt earned about 70% of the Black vote. I'm going to say that again. In 1936, President Roosevelt earned about 70% of the Black vote. This was a huge increase from the 1932 election. There aren't even numbers for that, but it does say that he just won a handful of Black votes. So that could have been 10, 20% or so, maybe even less. And then he increased that to 70%. Not because his policies were so great, mind you. This is how I look at this. It's not because FDR was so great. It's because the Republican Party wasn't interested. It's not that they didn't have anything to offer. They just didn't want to offer it to Black people. So they didn't bother to compete. Is this sounding familiar, y'all? The Democrats reached out. They paid lip service. They even crafted some policies that would benefit Black people, and the Republican Party was silent.
Okay, this is kind of where the innocence story breaks down. That Black voters didn't simply wake up and emotionally switch parties. Okay, they didn't emotionally start going to Democrats because FDR loved black people, even though his wife did have some relationships. I don't think it was because of his wife. I think it was because of the policies, right? And because at least um, they they try to move in that direction. Okay, even if it was a case of the Democratic Party, simply just trying to survive, right? So, um, also, I want to add, and I just now thought of it. Um, did you all know that affirmative action, right? We all know affirmative action was that a the initial push for it, was it a Democrat or was it a Republican where the first affirmative action program was initiated? No, I know you think it's a Democrat. I thought it would have been someone like Lyndon Johnson or John F. Kennedy. No, Richard Nixon. Yes, Richard Nixon. So go ahead and comment on that, Deuce.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that clip. There is a rich history about the change of political coalitions in the 20th century. Funny enough, I've been learning about my great grandfather recently. His name's Steward Davis, and he was a lawyer in Baltimore in the turn of the century, 20th century, 19th to the 20th century. And he actually was part of a group of African Americans who were advocating for African Americans in Baltimore to not be as aligned with the Republican Party and actually consider Democratic Party politics. And this kind of, it trends with the historical storyline of how the Democratic Party changed into the 20th century. The Democratic Party obviously was a sectional backwater for most of the end of the 19th century. And the Republican Party was sort of like the Democratic Party was after the New Deal into the Reagan Revolution, where it won most of the presidency, it controlled Congress most of the time, and it kind of set the policy agenda. And that's kind of the curse you see with big tent parties in American politics, especially with the party duopoly the way it is that a choice has to be made that once you co-opt the moral energy, in the case of the old GOP before the Reagan Goldwater Nixon GOP, the Lincoln GOP co-opted the moral energy of abolition, but then also made Faustian bargains with the growing robber baron population of the JP Morgans and the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers to push pro-industrial policies that reinstituted sharecropping in the South, took the federal military out of the South to protect freed schools, freedmen, towns, and then at the same time still was known as the Party of Lincoln long enough for Black voters to vote for them for a generation or two until that group of Black leaders from the movement, the NAACP, helped propel all the way to the progressive era that brought in a lot of different Americans of different backgrounds into challenging the political duopoly of the early 20th century. And so I think that's kind of the through line that Jeff is talking about in his video there, which is that the American duopoly is always co-opting moral energy and then widening the tent where the original purpose of the moral movement that built that party essentially is kind of lost, and there's a famous quote that obviously Bill Kristol and Charlie Sykes like to bring up because they were kind of the architects of the conservative movement that, and I don't have it verbatim right now, but every movement begins as like as an actual movement, but then turns into a racket after like 20 or 30 years. So, it really is just, again, a historical trend with American politics, especially in the two-party system, where one party becomes the controlled opposition and the other party becomes the arbiter of the leading policies of the moment. And so we live in an age now where the Democrats have been the controlled opposition to the point where Clinton remade the party to co-opt the Reaganite policies that are a departure from Nixon's policies. Nixon spearheaded the EPA. He desegregated the schools as much as he could. He was the president during the busing policies. Affirmative action was a big push under his time. And it wasn't because of Nixon, but it was because the moral energy, the leadership, and the structures that had been built by King and Malcolm, and before them, Ralph Abernathy and James Weldon Johnson, were still living within a generation of Black people where they were organizing, they were pushing for changes, and you couldn't really ignore them. Like, sadly, they're being ignored today. And so where that was kind of my thoughts from watching that video. And I would argue again that even though FDR obviously was a virulent racist and Eleanor Roosevelt was the Jiminy Cricket in his ear, reminding him of his conscience, he was president at a time where he even said it himself. He was trying to save capitalism from itself. And his allies called him basically a traitor to his class. So he grows up as this patrician from the most patrician of American states, New York. And, he basically is from Hyde Park, upstate New York, grew up in the wealth of lap of luxury. And he is very influenced by his older cousin's presidency, Teddy Roosevelt. He was a big Teddy Roosevelt fan. And Teddy Roosevelt, most notably, maybe not in popular history, but is notable for splitting the Republican Party. So Teddy Roosevelt tries to co-opt the progressive movement in his presidency by going up against J.P. Morgan and going up against the industrialists and pushing for populist policies and redistributive and social safety policies. And the party essentially had to go along with it because Teddy Roosevelt was such a big personality. He was on the cover of all the new magazines coming out in the modern U.S. press by the 1900s and 1910s. Magazine culture was just building up. He was on the, he was doing whistle stop tours across the country and barnstorming and doing these big speeches. He got shot and decided to finish his speech even though he was bleeding from being shot. So Teddy Roosevelt is this larger than life personality. So he's kind of hard for the party infrastructure to balk when he is president. But then he decides he won't be president for a third term. And this is before the time where Congress creates a rule that you can only be president 2 consecutive times. We need to remember consecutive because Trump's going to try and say he wasn't president for 2 consecutive terms. And Teddy Roosevelt decides, I'll just give it to my successor. And so he gets really disenchanted with his successor's policy in Honduras and with his what he feels like his successor's policy and not really being as aggressive with the banks and the industrialists as he was. And so he starts the Bull Moose Party. And he essentially splits the Republican Party from Republicans who were at least somewhat interested in the progressive movement at the time and Republicans who were purely pro-business. And that allowed for the first Democrat to be elected president in like 30 or 40 years, which was Woodrow Wilson, who is most famous for showing Birth of a Nation in the White House. And Woodrow Wilson becomes president, and that has never happened in what historians call the GOP golden age, that period from the Civil War into the 1920s, where the GOP was the ruling political force in America and the Democrats were the controlled opposition. Woodrow Wilson basically creates this policy of new nationalism, which is basically off of Teddy Roosevelt's, I forget, he had another kind of new something, but Woodrow Wilson does the same thing. He co-opts the progressive movement within the Democratic Party, but not in favor of blacks. He does it in favor of Black people. I don't really like blacks as much the way it's been used recently, but Black people. He does it really in favor of immigrants, the new Italian, Eastern European, still flowing from the 19th century Irish immigrants, all coming from Europe who were not part of the whiteness, you know, the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant class line, they were kind of seen as the lower whites, but they were living in these tenements in New York City and Chicago and Boston. And, you know, the plight of their life had been circulating around the US. And so what Italian and Eastern European and Irish immigrants were going through in America was being used as a poster child for pushing for food safety, pushing for housing regulations, pushing for a social safety net. That was not for Black people. And so that contributes and that moves forward into the Roosevelt presidency. Now, where I would say that the Roosevelt presidency is different than our current anti-Trump allies on the right is that the Roosevelt presidency was pushing for policies that had gone against the center right to far right policy tradition of the United States in its history up until that point. Going back to the founding days, the Federalists were seen as the conservatives of the time after the Constitution was signed, but they wanted to push for improvements, infrastructure, and government involvement in developing the country. And the Jefferson Democrats or Democratic Republicans under Jefferson and James Madison were pushing for a small government, more freedom-based agenda that gave the states more power. And so that gets inverted throughout the 19th century, where you then see the Whigs, who come out of the death of the Federalists, start pushing for basic improvements. And that's like John Quincy Adams, who he basically is against the Jacksonian Democrats at the time, because the Jacksonian Democrats are just for frontier expansion and attacking the banks, most notably killing the Second National Bank of the US, where John Quincy Adams wants to use the government to help build bridges and roads, because the northern states were pushing into the what's now the Midwest and onto the Oregon territories. And so you see this push and pull throughout American history, but throughout American history, the ability to not have left-leaning policies has always lost to the ability to have right-leaning policies. And so now you have FDR in this moment where the country is literally on the brink of revolution. And he is basically telling the capitalist class, we have to have some basic semblance of a social safety net in this country, or we won't have a country anymore. And that was revolutionary on itself. And that revolutionary change trickled down. I hate to use that term because obviously the cultural weight of it, but it trickled down to Black Americans. Not really, though, because as we know, housing was given to white Americans, and that's how they started building generational wealth through the FHA. You know, a lot of the work progress administration opportunities were segregated or blocked off from Black people in the southern states. So obviously that was not for Black people, but it was a movement forward in a policy direction that had been fought over for over 100 years at that point, and it helped minority populations in the meantime. What the current Never Trumpers, conservatives, are trying to do is they're trying to basically say that progressive policies or policies that are attacking the power of corporations, trying to give the government more responsibility or the resources to have more responsibility to shore up the social safety net that has been attacked for the last 40 years. Those are bad policies, and we're also against Trump. And that kind of rhetorical game or narrative, narrative magic that they're doing does not help push the most vulnerable populations in America to a place where they have better social safety or are less inclined to be enchanted by demagoguery and vote for another Trump. And so that's where I argue that they are different from the uneasy allies that African Americans and other historically marginalized groups have had to ally with in the past, because the Never Trump conservatives are not interested in helping us push policies that move us forward and even repudiate, rebut, or implicate the failed policies that came before Trump.
So, and I think you already partially answered this question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it anyway for the benefit of the listeners here. Why can't anti-Trump voters use the Bulwark without pretending the Bulwark is our ideological home? If black voters could use the Democratic Party without pretending it had clean hands.
Is that the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, yes. It's interesting because I think what is going on is that the Democratic Party itself is elevating, and I think it's a wonky term, so I'm going to try my best not to use it a lot, but reactionary centrism. Wonky when I mean kind of like in the weeds, like something that people who are reading policy papers are using, not people who are just casually tuning in. So I'll try my best to not say that. But, the Democratic Party is still very much enamored with being the controlled opposition, which means that they are taking money from the same people who give MAGA Republicans money. They are okay with the same policies that enrich business at the behest of the middle class or workers' rights. And they are lobbied and given compensation for having those policies. So it is easier for them to elevate the Bulwark, the Never Trump conservatives at the Atlantic, or give Nicole Wallace and Joe Scarborough and a lot of the other MS Now lineup, and then kick Joy Reid off. And before that, Melissa Harris Perry, and try to get Megyn Kelly for a $6 billion contract that only lasted less than a year. It's easier for the Democratic Party and their apparatchiks, which includes the media and narrative forces and the campaign forces, to constantly reinforce this good conservative rather than listen to the people on the left or progressives or the younger people or the people who never liked Reagan or never liked Nixon. It's easier for them to push those people down and highlight the, Bush Republicans who saw the light and didn't like that Trump was aesthetically disapproving, even if he is covertly pushing the same kinds of policies they supported before 2016. It's easier for them to elevate those people because there's really no risk for the current power structure within the Democratic Party. Because once you stop elevating those people, you have to then accept the reality that the Democratic Party is just as complicit with the rise of Trump and the state of the country today as the Republican Party is. And that means that nobody has a job. So that's kind of, so that is kind of, and look, it's human nature. Self-preservation is human nature. So I'm not going to, sit here and be overly idealistic and understand that when you're dealing in the world of politics, politicians, everybody's on the take, everybody's on the make, everybody's making dirty deals somewhere. However, if the moment is as existential as Democrats want to run on in the different campaigns they're funding across the country, then they have to actually act that way. And that's probably the one quote that I'll take from Charlie Sykes that I'll say I'm in sync with is, if this is an anti-democratic threat, if this is really a fascist threat, then act like it. Now, where I differ from Charlie is that Charlie would direct that at the progressives he doesn't like, because he would say that they're not willing to work with the Republicans or the anti-Trump Republicans to get rid of Trump, even if that means sacrificing all of their policy goals and all of their frameworks that they are enacting to secure not only their personhood, but their legal rights. I would say, on the other hand, the Democrats aren't acting like it's an existential fascist threat, because they're not really willing to interrogate the reason that Trump can even flirt with having a $1.776 billion slush fund, or the reason that Trump can disregard the courts or disregard the judges, or the reason that Trump gets away with, destroying the East Wing and building a UFC court in our UFC stadium in front of the White House, the reason that Trump was able to delegitimize 2 impeachments and a special counsel who did a thorough investigation into his ties with Russia during his first presidential campaign. Because institutionally, all this stuff is damning, but if the institution has lost its credibility among most people not living in the American university, DC Beltway consultant world, then Trump doesn't have to follow any of those things. And so the question is, why is that the case? Because the Democrats haven't really made an argument that they are much better, or that they are even trying to do a kind of material reexamination of how their own policies, how their own triangulation, how their own alliances with the Never Trump Republicans, how they laundered Liz Cheney as a hero of the Republic, even though she called the left like disgusting people at one point. She supported all of Trump's policies. She just didn't like that he took the mask off and waved Confederate flags in front of the Capitol. That doesn't make the Democratic Party seem authentic. And I put up a clip today where Sarah Longwell was talking to Sam Stein yesterday, and she basically said the far left has a professionalism problem, and that if they, if they just want to be all spitfire and authenticity, they at least need to like be professional about it or something. And I flagged that because I was pretty much like, I think that that's not an issue of professionalism, because that basis isn't true, because Zoran Mondani is very professional. Ro Khanna is very professional. Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar are very passionate about their religion and about people who look like them. And so they're maybe passionate people of color isn't professional in her eyes, but they have apologized for ways that their words have been misinterpreted. They have worked within the process. AOC is the perfect vision of professionalism by trying to push her Green New Deal, working with Nancy Pelosi, and transforming her political career into a way that she can build consensus between the corporate side of the Democrats and the left grassroots side of the Democrats. So that's just a false premise altogether, and just sounds like someone who's angry that the party is realizing that her strategy of courting a small minority of suburban white Republicans who are Republicans in policy, but just don't like that Trump makes them have conversations about racism at every country club dinner they have. That's a small group of people that if you win them, most likely you won't win them. That's not going to change the electoral outcome. What's going to change the electoral outcome is inspiring people that there is going to be a politics of imagination and a politics that fearlessly will call out the failed corporatism, the failed center-right policy center of the Obama years, of the Bush years, of the Trump years, of the Clinton years, of the Reagan years, and even going back to some of Carter's compromises. So, that is really kind of where we're coming from, where Evan and I in our show aren't really saying that there's a purity test where we want to kick the Bulwark out. We think the Bulwark can exist all that it wants. It can, obviously, it's free speech. They can have their opinions and have their thoughts, but at the same time, they have just been wrong on so many things, going back to their senior fellow or senior intellectual statesman, William Crystal, who's been famously wrong about the Iraq War. So, they've just had such a track record of not being right that it's not only political malpractice for the Democrats to keep elevating them or their universe of pundits, but it's also irresponsible for people to be given them as a package or as a product of reasonable adult political conversation without giving the context that they have been wrong about a lot of things. And so maybe they shouldn't have the same narrative weight that they have been given over the last 10 years. Or as I call the anti-Trump genre, the anti-Trump conservative genre, where, there's just a whole genre of writing and political commentary now of, well, this isn't what Reagan wanted, even though Reagan campaigned in Philadelphia, Mississippi, even though Reagan knew he had to make these compromises, or this isn't what Bush wanted, even though Bush had to be super homophobic, whether he wanted to or not, to win in 2004, or even though he started a war with bad intelligence, which we are seeing now today with our current wars. So, these people can exist and they can definitely be in the pro-democracy tent, but they can't be taken as seriously as a lot of institutional forces with the biggest amplification powers have been giving them the level of seriousness that they've gotten.
All right, you got me on the ropes here, but I'm still in the fight. I'm gonna play one more visual or one more clip here, and then we're gonna get to your clips. Okay, so let's go ahead and play this video. First, let me say this is from the U.S. Civil Rights History Channel, entitled "President Harry Truman and Civil Rights." Okay, now let's go ahead and play this clip.
With his back to the Lincoln Memorial, Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, becomes the first president to ever address the NAACP.
The extension of civil rights today means not protection of the people against the government, but protection of the people by the government.
At the Democratic Convention in 1948, Truman goes further. Pressured by Northern black voters and civil rights activists, he endorses a strong civil rights platform, placing his own candidacy at risk.
There was this strong sentiment, these are states' rights, these are local matters. So far as Truman was concerned, that wasn't getting us anyplace. The federal government had to move.
30 rebellious Southerners storm out in protest.
Strom Thurmond, who was the leader of the segregationists, was approached by a reporter after he had led these four state delegations out, and he was asked, how come you did this when President Truman is doing precisely the same thing that Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in terms of support of civil rights? And Thurmond turned to the reporter and immediately responded, yes, but there's a difference. Truman really means it.
Outraged by Truman's action, Strom Thurmond, governor of South Carolina, challenges him for the presidency under the banner of the newly formed States' Rights Party.
The Southern revolt against President Truman reaches its climax at Birmingham under the States' Rights banner. More than 6,000 flocked to the Rump Convention to join in the protest against the president's civil rights program. 13 Southern states are represented in the uproarious session which precedes the nomination of Governors Thurmond of South Carolina and Fielding Wright of Mississippi as party standard bearers. Governor Thurmond attacks the civil rights plank.
It simply means that it's another effort on the part of the president to dominate the country by force and to put into effect these uncalled for and these damnable proposals he has recommended under the guise of so-called civil rights. And I'll tell you, the American people from one side or the other had better wake up and oppose such a program, and if they don't, the next thing will be a totalitarian state in these United States.
The battle lines were drawn. 10 days later, after being pressured by black labor leader A. Philip Randolph, Truman signs Executive Order 9981, desegregating the armed forces. It was a dream fulfilled for Randolph, who had been fighting to integrate the Army for over a decade. In 1941, Randolph had threatened to march on Washington if then-President Roosevelt did not desegregate the armed forces and change government hiring practices.
A. Philip Randolph, who was head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, members throughout the country advised the president that if he didn't do it, he would bring over 10,000 of his members to Washington to march in protest.
This scared Washington. Roosevelt realized he needed to do something to buy Randolph off. Roosevelt sent his wife, Eleanor, to meet with A. Philip Randolph to get the march called off.
As we're gearing up to fight a war against fascism, this would not be a good thing for the president to have happen.
With all due respect, Mr. President, I thought I might say on the part of the Negro people, they feel they are not wanted in the armed forces of this country. They are feeling that they are being shunted about. A. Philip Randolph.
Under pressure to act, President Roosevelt makes a concession.
At the 11th hour, the last minute, President Roosevelt issued an executive order, 8802, which established the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which basically said that there could not be any discrimination in hiring practices in the defense industry.
Admitting his fear of Southern reprisal, Roosevelt had stopped short of meeting all of Randolph's demands. Truman did not succumb to that fear. In 1948, with a strong civil rights platform, Truman wins re-election. By electing Truman, voters seemed to affirm that supporting civil rights was no longer political suicide.
Harry Truman was elected without the votes of 4 southern states. And it became even more obvious at that point that the South was on the losing side in this battle to retain segregation.
Jackie Robinson opens the Dodgers' second with a home run into the left field seats. The Brooks, who clinched the pennant on the final day of the season, beating out the Braves.
Even as the South resists, racial barriers fall throughout the nation. In 1947, Jackie Robinson breaks through the color line in baseball. Black actors break the stereotypical mold in which they have been traditionally cast and portrayed real human beings. And the United States Supreme Court declares segregation on interstate buses and trains unconstitutional.
Like if we are
I think it's muted.
There we go. Truman may be the sharpest example here of the point I'm trying to make. He was a man with ugly racial views, but still moved state power in a way that mattered. And I'm not saying that somehow cleanses him, but it does force us to ask a harder question, right? Do we measure the soul or do we measure the machinery? Are we trying to look at the present policies and stated views of the Bulwark and determine if they're going to go right or left, or are we organizing and committing ourselves to moving the scale forward no matter who is in office?
Yes. So
well, and also that begs the question of, why are we talking, for someone who is only looking at this, maybe tuning in for 10, 15 minutes, they're saying to themselves, why are we talking about the Bulwark? Trump is the problem. Go.
Yes, definitely. First, with the example of Truman, it definitely is. I think there might be an echo again.
Yeah. Gotcha. I gotcha.
Oh, thank you. So with the example of Truman, there is obviously, as the documentary pointed out, that this was because of the grassroots effort of the Black community at the time, A. Philip Randolph, who's the famous labor leader. Not only the 100 million man, the 100 or the Million Man March that he threatened Roosevelt with, but also his work with the Pullman, the Porters Union, black workers who were on trains that would travel south, and they would have to work as domestics or as service workers, and we were obviously laboring in horrendous conditions, but they also were integral to bringing information to Southern sharecroppers who were interested in opportunities going north, and they were able to kind of bring that information down with them when trains traveled from north to the south. So A. Philip Randolph also was very integral in that operation as well. And he and also the Double V movement, Victory at Home and Victory in Europe, Fascism in Europe, and Fascism in the United States, was also a big part of really influencing Truman to have to desegregate the military, because again, you had this giant war, America's finest hour, as the popular history likes to call it, where the American industrial and military machine comes together to defeat the Japanese in the Pacific and the Germans in Europe, and that required basically rationing, hiring people to work in factories, rebuilding factories, building planes, producing a plane every like 2 hours, I think, or even less time, and producing artillery, and just basically this miracle of military production would have not been possible without the explicit input of Black Americans. I was looking through my grandmother's yearbook the other day, and it was from her high school yearbook from 1944, and it was actually celebrating the American war effort against the Nazis in Europe. And this was Douglas High School in Baltimore, which was a segregated school that was underfunded due to segregation. And so would you be able to get that same patriotism today with the Black community? I don't know. Some would say hopefully.
Was it patriotism, or was it the Double V campaign that you mentioned, or was it maybe a combination of both? We wanted to defeat this, what we viewed, and I'm sure a lot of Black Americans viewed, maybe not so many white, but what we viewed as this white supremacy over abroad, so we could take that fight back to the United States and defeat it here. Am I correct?
I think it's both. I think there's a lot to also be studied or talked about around the fact that up until the Black Power movement in the 1960s, the idea of Black nationalism and kind of the anti-American perspective of civil rights had been marginalized by the pro-American. And this goes all the way back to how Frederick Douglass used the Constitution to say that the America's original meaning was enfranchising Black Americans, and we just haven't met that goal. And then that got a little bit of pushback with Marcus Garvey and the movement to go back to Africa. And then, but the prevailing narrative in the civil rights legacy from the end of slavery all the way into the split of the civil rights movement in the late 60s was that we would use America's better angels to try and promote our own freedom and liberation. And it's not until after the King assassination where you kind of get this schism within the Black community of America's kind of an inherent evil, regardless of how you try to put its rhetoric up in the light, compared to people who still want to believe in America's rhetoric actually meaning something one day. And so that's where you kind of see the marginalization of that anti-American side within the civil rights movement start to dissipate and have a little bit more weight within the conversation within the Black community. So I think that's why, going back to what you were saying about Double V and why Black patriotism was actually a force within the World War II era, I think it could be both. And I think it's just historical timing and historical forces about how the Black leaders at the time, again, there's still classism within the Black community. Black leaders often would marginalize the more radical or more, I guess radical, but more anti-American side of the civil rights rhetoric over the pro-American side, and that had its benefits and also its its setbacks as we see today. Hopefully, more benefits than setbacks, but that is crucial. And again, the act of desegregating the military, as Truman did, was revolutionary on its own footing. Again, this is a stark change within the way the U.S. military had operated for 150 years. And this was a stark policy change. Again, that kind of thing is a material movement forward that is not shared by our center-right or far-right allies in the anti-Trump movement, because they still do not want to expand the Supreme Court. Most of them do not want to make DC a state. Most of them do not want to, there was a big fight over whether we pass a HR 1, the more expansive voting right, voter secure law, back when the Democrats had the Congress in 2020, I believe, to 2022, or if we would pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or the John Lewis Act, which was kind of a watered down version of HR 1. And a lot of the Never Trump conservatives and conservatives on the right lobbied to pass the lesser voting law. And that voting law never got passed anyway. And by 2021, we are already 8 years after Shelby v. Holder, where the Voting Rights Act starts to get institutionally gutted, all the way into today with Louisiana v. Calais, where the Voting Rights Act is just pretty much hollowed out altogether. So by following the Never Trump conservatives, we're not really pushing any policy or institutional weight towards human rights, towards civil rights, towards racial equality any way further. We're just reinforcing frames that allow us to explain away why we're losing the civil rights gains of the 50s and 60s and the 70s, but it's being explained away by people who are anti-Trump on the surface, but against the policy movements under the surface that would actually reinstate the rights revolutions of the 1950s and 60s. Again, Never Trump conservatives were also, and Sarah Longwell was one of them, was also pushing the rhetoric that Democrats should stop talking about reproductive rights because it's just not that electrifying of an issue anymore. It was electrifying in 2022, and we haven't heard that much about it since then, even though we forget that a whole constitutional right was rolled back by this activist right-wing court. And that is something the Democrats should be talking about nonstop. But instead, we have the right wing of the Democratic Party telling us that we need to talk about things that Trump voters would be more accessible in hearing, which is high gas prices and high cost of living, and how Trump is failing against his promises on not being militant, not going to wars, and lowering the price of groceries and gas prices. Yes, he is going against those promises. But at the same time, the Trump voters have already shown us that they're not really electrified by whether Trump is going to follow his policy promises or not, because we live in a post-policy America where politics is more about team sport and identity over actual policy preferences. And B, Trump represents something a lot more to Trump voters, or to the set of voters who would never check Trump voters. Again, that kind of 20% of moderate, white people who wouldn't really go to bat against the 30% of Trump cultists, because Trump is very willing to be vocal and push the machinery of government to hurt minorities and historically voiceless populations. And so this is an entirely failed outlook by the Never Trump conservatives or by the center right of the pro-democracy coalition, because A, it's not giving us any institutional gains. It's not pushing any policy forward that allows us to reenact the policy gaps that have happened in recent memory. And at the same time, it's laundering a myth about Trump voters or the appeal of Trump and our ability to win Trump voters while also respecting the rights and history of marginalized people that is completely unhelpful for this moment. So again, yes, Truman was a virulent racist. There's historical accounts saying that the N-word may have been his favorite word by the amount of times that he used it. But at the same time, desegregating the military is a material win that had been pushed by 20, 30 years, 40 years, considering the start of the NAACP, of Black leaders and Black grassroots action that forced Truman to have to swallow that pill, and also forced FDR to have to swallow some pills he didn't want to swallow. But they were material gains forward. We have not seen the same material gains when it comes to voting rights, when it comes to labor laws, when it comes to taxing the wealth that we saw in that period of American history. And yet we're still being told that the agenda of trying to reach the mythical middle, not trying to alienate the potential swing Trump voter, not talking about institutional reform and governmental reform, like expanding the Supreme Court to meet the number of circuit courts around the country, or making DC a statehood because California has 40 times the population of Wyoming, but the same amount of Senate seats. You know, we're not talking about institutional changes within the way American governance and electoral politics works, because we're being told that Trump is bad by the Democratic leadership and by the center-right apparatchiks that they've elevated, that Trump is bad, but also we need to just return to the normal of before, and that everything will be solved if we do that. But that doesn't account for the fact that Black voters are already losing political representation in southern states like Florida and Alabama and Louisiana already. It doesn't talk about the fact that unless we codify Roe v. Wade through Congress, that we're never going to get a unified abortion reproductive rights law across the country. It doesn't talk about the fact that Citizens United has opened up the ability for politicians to be even more bought off than they were in the past, so they don't even have to follow the way that people are feeling within their districts. We're not talking about institutional changes that need to happen in order to make sure that demagoguery, a corporate oligarchy, and industrial aristocracy are something that can be combated against by the people, and not something that we have an inaccessible ability to advocate for. Again, last example, and then I'll shut up. I said, you know, like, as you know, I'll let you go. But Abigail Spanberger was hugely pushed up by was promoted by the center right Democrats, the Bulwark Democrats, the Pod Save Democrats, who are now kind of in their allyship with the Bulwark. They were pushed by these people, and Abigail Spanberger is a CIA mom. Nothing wrong with that, but she's a surveillance state product who has recently vetoed a collective bargaining act within the Virginia legislature. And that has pissed off a lot of people who are realizing that if Amazon workers have to pee in their pants or risk getting fired on the factory floor, there obviously needs to be some conversation about what's happened to labor laws in America. If Mickey Sherrill, who was also the surveillance suburban wine mom, who was pushed up by the centrist center-right Democrat consultant apparatchik and their leaders like Chuck Schumer, who allow them to have the narrative control over the conversation while also reinforcing caricatures of AOC and other left-leaning or progressive candidates just calling for basic human rights. Mickey Sherrill just sticked the New Jersey National Guard on the people who were protesting Delaney Hall, the ICE concentration camp, and that was all her doing. Yet the Bulwark was telling us that she is the example of the moderate fighter, not the progressive fighter, but the Alyssa Slotkin type fighter, the person who doesn't really have to talk about raw policy changes or raw institutional changes, but just speaks terribly about Trump and says, you know, Trump bad, but we don't need to really change any of the undergirding wiring. That is what we're being promoted, and that is why I Evan and I in our show, Reality Checking the Bulwark, is again not saying there needs to be a purity check or a purity test within the Democratic Party, but that we shouldn't have the Democratic establishment itself elevating voices that have had a poor track record on being able to bring change and release the conditions that bring us Trumpism. And at the same time, they're not allies like those in the past, like Truman, like FDR, like Sherman, because those people were forced to push forward material gains for African Americans, whether it was giving them land after slaughtering a bunch of people in Georgia, whether it was creating a works progress administration or federally funded jobs that inevitably hired some Black people, even if they weren't meant to, and also built the national infrastructure so that rural districts in the South could get electrified, that obviously poor white people benefited from as well, to Truman desegregating the military, to LBJ. Maybe LBJ was against poverty because he grew up in poverty, but he also was forced by King and by SNCC to push the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act by them marching in the streets. These are hardcore policy changes that change the face of the government itself. And our current allies in the anti-Trump movement are not calling for that. They are calling for us to go back to Reaganite policies while still just saying Trump is bad in the process. I think you're muted again. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There we go.
I feel like I'm Don Lemon here. You know how Don Lemon's always, but he's got a producer to help him out. Like, I got to be on my toes here with this mic thing. Okay, so let's move from history to the present. The question becomes this, all right? When the Bulwark diagnoses racism, sexism, democracy, populism, and coalition politics, are they helping the coalition see clearly, or are they teaching the coalition how to accommodate the structure? So in this Bulwark clip, rather, we have Sarah and JVL. Did I get that right? Sarah, JVL and Sarah. We're talking about the Harris loss, racism and sexism as a pie chart. Let's go ahead and play that clip.
Like
it's
we are
predicting Biden's in there.
Oh yeah, that's right. Well,
but you're right. The
having the white guy, having the one win be the white guy.
Yeah. Sure.
I think that as a predictive question of what will Democratic primary voters do, I think it is highly unlikely that they will nominate a woman as the standard bearer in 2028. And I am happy to stand by that. I think that is now, happy to talk about the should aspect of it. But like if you told me like, well, you could roll the dice with Gretchen Whitmer, I would say no, thank you. If I were a Democratic voter. I don't know who else the rest of the field is, but like you've just lost two deeply important elections, and I don't know, like if the question was like a female candidate who was basically on par with whoever the best other male candidate is as a political talent, then I would say, I don't know, man, that would make me very nervous to do that again at this particular moment. If the question was like, it's Gretchen Whitmer or 90-year-old Bernie, then like, okay, fine, that's what you got to do. But if you have Gretchen Whitmer and Wes Moore, and Wes Moore is looking very good, I would say, maybe don't try a woman again. American electorate seems pretty bad on that.
So you think they're more sexist than racist?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
Okay.
But again, who knows? But like, I don't know. Like, do you want to take that chance just because you're trying to prove a point? I wouldn't.
No, I would take the chance if there was a political talent. If the most talented political person on the stage was Gretchen Whitmer, and you were like, man, she is electrifying. I haven't seen a ton out of her lately, but if I thought like she was the best candidate, I would go with it. I thought they should have gone with her this time.
But these things are never like, oh, it's obvious that the best one is this person. Right. Or they're rarely
I don't know.
It's obvious the best person is. Like in 2008, Obama was clearly the best candidate. But like, I'm sorry, Gretchen Whitmer is not Barack Obama. And in most cases, like in the average field, the difference between 1, 2, and 3 in terms of political talent is often like, this much or this much. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not that.
But this is maybe more my point, is that you can't run with somebody who's this much better than the field. Like, the biggest thing that Democrats should be doing is not thinking about race or gender or sexual. They should be like, who's spectacular? Who's knocking our socks off? Who gets up and does something that's different from the rest of these also-rans? Who stands out?
Or
that's what Democrats need to be thinking about right now.
Or they could be thinking about who isn't a politician and who can code as just maybe the answer is like, stop looking at governors and senators and find somebody who codes as a authentic famous person, maybe Kark Mubin. I don't know.
This is going to be the thing that you and I end up agreeing on the absolute most. The show will get so boring when the two of us become like random Mark Cuban stans. For maybe slightly different reasons.
Yeah, I want to be very clear about my Mark Cuban thoughts. I don't know Mark Cuban at all. I've never met the guy, never interacted with him. I do not have any opinions on whether or not he would be a good president. I have zero opinions on this. My only opinions are that I think we now live in a world where what people respond to is celebrity and authenticity, or perceived authenticity, and that Mark Cuban has that and has a money machine that belongs to himself, which is also incredibly important, it turns out, in ways that...
Yeah, no, it's similar to mine, except that I'll say this for Mark Cuban.
We're bleeding into
who, again, I'll reserve the right to decide.
Next one here. So let's comment on what we just heard. What went through my mind, particularly as I was listening to that, and how they are speculating and almost seems like plotting, like they're trying to send a message about the kind of candidates that the Democratic Party should be putting forward. I'm thinking to myself, how is this relevant to the average voter, Democratic voter who goes into the polling booth? They're not looking at this, right? Progressives are not looking at this. Democratic political consultants are looking at this. So is that who this message is directed to? And furthermore, your critique seems to be that racism and sexism are treated as one slice of the pie, when they may actually season the whole pie. Is that fair? I know I threw a lot at you, but I'm going to give you time to reply. Go ahead.
Oh, no, for sure. And I think the clip that I sent before this was but I'll just explain it. The JVL asks Sarah.
Did I play them out of order?
That was the second. The first one was where they do, but it's really small. So they ask what percentage they think racism and sexism had to do with Kamala Harris's loss. And JVL says that he thinks it was 30%. And to JVL's credit, he has openly said that he thinks his biggest analytical flaw as a thinker and political writer throughout his life has been his inability to understand the centrality of race in American politics. So I think his 30% number is coming from the fact that he is like, okay, maybe racism actually is a through line throughout America and not just a side quest that, the way I've been taught in American history from the 70s to today. And so Sarah says that she thinks it's 7%, just 7%. And so I like the point you made about who is this audience for? Because one thing I also want to flag is that the Democrats came out with a controversial report, which was like the autopsy before the autopsy last year, which basically was saying that the Democrats' adherence to identity politics is the reason that they keep losing. And Sarah came out and admitted on one of the Bulwark podcasts that she was one of the people who consulted in that report. And this report was done by the Move Forward PAC and Third Way, which are notorious like centrist Democratic research and political action groups that are constantly trying to co-opt right-wing framing and politics for the Democrats to use. And so if you're dealing with someone who thinks 7% is only about racism and sexism, and that the other 93% is just because of whatever reason it is that day, economic anxiety, too much Hollywood framing of politics, down the line, then that person doesn't really have a grasp on how American politics, as we just spent the last hour talking about, has always had this third rail of race that has been attached to labor movements, has been attached to health policies, has been attached to understanding how we build a social safety net in this country, and whether we believe that social safety net is for everyone or only for a certain group of people who don't deserve that social safety net. And that is a crucial through line throughout American politics and American history. And 7%, saying that 7% of the reason Kamala Harris lost was because of racism and sexism, especially in the context that her opponent was incoherently calling her stupid, telling other people that she's not really black and she chose to be black in the last few years of her life, and has pretty much openly campaigned on a post-policy structure of presidential campaigns that only talks about other people, demonizes groups of people, ethnicities, saying they eat cats and dogs, saying that they're importing their racist, saying that black women are dumb or should go back to where they came from, even if where they came from was the Bronx. That has been the Trump style for the last 10 years. And that went in overdrive during his campaign against Kamala Harris, where he pretty much just called her dumb for 6 months and still won the presidency. So for you to say that only 7% of it was racism, then you're assuming that every Trump voter, even that 30% of Trump voters, or that 20% that doesn't really believe in Trump heavily, but won't really go to bat against the other 30%, you're saying that those people have policy purely on the mind, which I think has been proven time and again, that is not what is happening. People are voting and looking at politics through the lens of, does this person look like me? Does this person speak like me? And in an age where I go to Starbucks and see Asian lady with blue hair, and my kids have like a rainbow set of friends and they're being told what's racism and what's not at school, I'm a little bit anxious about the way America's becoming more browner, or having more different kinds of people come into my orbit that I was not raised or conditioned to really see as normal or even be comfortable with. And the fact that there is not a heavy consideration of that, and the reason this conversation even started is because Jonathan Capehart on MSNBC, when it was still MSNBC, had a panel of women of all backgrounds come onto his show when he had his Sunday show. And if he still has it or not, I don't watch cable news anymore. Like, I was at Media Matters and I had to watch too much of it, so I don't watch it anymore. But Jonathan Capehart had these people come on, and most of them said that Kamala lost because of racism and sexism. So JVL and Sarah wouldn't have even talked about this or revealed their own perspective of how little they think about racism or sexism if that didn't enter the news cycle because of Jonathan Capehart's segment on his Sunday show. So, that is, again, why I shared that clip. And the second thing is in the clip that we just saw, Sarah then says that it shouldn't be about race or gender, which is admirable. Yes, it shouldn't be about that. But then she basically says that as long as the candidate meets this spectacular ceiling of just being a good candidate, a good political athlete. And that's kind of how Sarah thinks in my years of analyzing her. She doesn't really think in terms of like historical structures or policy. She thinks in terms of winning the game, which is oddly enough what her colleague Tim Miller has told on himself about in his book Why We Did It, and Evan and I talk about it in our Tim Miller episode, where he basically says they grew up in a DC culture where the people who got the biggest bucks and the biggest attention were the people who won political campaigns, saying whatever they needed to say to whoever they needed to say it, regardless of what the policy brains were doing in the back room when they were creating white papers and creating policy. And so they come from that world where politics is more of a sport than an actual form of governance. And so Sarah thinks about it all as like a sport to be won. And here's the thing, that ceiling that she puts a good Democratic candidate at is never going to be met by the minorities that have already tried to meet it. And we saw this, like her or I don't want to say hate her, but like her or dislike her, Jasmine Crockett. I think there are some things I'm not really a fan of with her, and there's some things I'm really a big fan of. However, when she ran against James Tallarico, the Bulwark constantly framed her as kind of the loud, angry Black woman who would turn off a lot of moderate white Texas voters. And we need James Tallarico because he's openly saying that we're going to reach Trump voters and we're going to use their better Christian beliefs against them or for them, and realize that they'll come to the light when they realize Ken Paxton or John Cornyn or Trump are not really real Christians. It's been 10 years since I've been told that for 10 years, and I haven't seen that light come down, but okay. But then the way they frame Jasmine Crockett as unserious, as angry without a cause or without a plan, that is an example of what happens when you have a minority in Democratic politics who is speaking with the same ferocity and passion that a lot of minorities, progressive white people, moderate white people, people of all American backgrounds are feeling about this increasingly disillusioning time. But when a Black woman speaks with that ferocity, or when a Muslim woman speaks with that ferocity, they no longer meet the Sarah Longwell test of above and beyond for the kind of politics. You saw this with her, with the clip I sent you about Zoran Mondani, and I posted today, where she called him an idiot 3 times in a row. And she basically said she doesn't like him. And JVL and Tim Miller kind of try to talk her down. But again, it shows that it's like if a certain kind of person, like a Mickey Sherrill or Abigail Spanberger, a suburban white wine mom, speaks with a little bit of ferocity, but also is about keeping the neoliberal, neoconservative status quo, then that's fine. But if you have someone like Zoran Mondani who's talking about subsidizing grocery stores and bringing dignity back to workers of all backgrounds, and also being very clear with his Muslim and Ugandan heritage that he's uncomfortable with American foreign policy right now, then he's no longer above and beyond that, reaching that spectacular threshold that Sarah said any Democratic candidate needs to reach. And guess what? Zoran Mondani won the mayoral race with all demographics and had the biggest turnout in a mayoral race since the 1960s. So, it's basically like, if this is the strategy that Democrats are getting, as you pointed out, this is the content that they're taking in and the people they're looking at as the big brains for coming up with new strategy, then there's a big problem within the Democrats' ability to imagine how to not only inspire their own base, which are the Black people and the young people and the women and the Americans that they now take for granted as they watch their rights be taken away, but if they're really true to what they're saying about attracting Trump voters, attracting that set of Trump voters that actually voted for both AOC and Trump in 2024, which you're not going to do if you keep pushing corporatist policy, because those people who voted for AOC and Trump voted for outsiders who are basically saying they're going to bring back economic security to the country. So it's all around not helpful And that's why I shared the clip.
Yeah, a great example of what you're talking about. Plattner, right? This is someone who the Democratic establishment is almost seems like they're working hand in hand with Republican operatives to try and squash. And this is the type of guy who he reminds me of that white uncle who will just say whatever the hell he wants to say, doesn't care if he hurts anyone's feelings, impulsive, doesn't give a damn. you know, um, I could never see the Bulwark supporting a candidate like that, right? But this is the kind of candidate that Maine Democratic voters want. Damn the Democratic consulting class or the establishment. They want him.
Yeah, and I mean, oddly enough, and this is why I haven't really commented on it. I'm still like watching in watch mode to see how this all plays out with Plattner. The Bulwark.
Yeah, and hey, don't mistake. I'm not saying I'm some big Plattner, fanboy. Okay, I'm not. I'm just saying this is a better alternative than Susan Collins.
Oh yeah, and here's the funny thing. I mean, funny in terms of someone who watches way too much Bulwark and follows way too much political communications. The Bulwark actually is kind of behind Plattner. They kind of like reluctantly got behind Plattner, and
okay,
so then
okay.
But then their former friends over at the National Review and who they call the anti-Trumpers, the like Republicans who were anti-Trump in 2016, but once he took control of the party, they just like co-signed and became Trump fans. They are now calling the Bulwark like not real conservatives or people who don't believe in anything, because you're basically they're claiming that the Bulwark has a personality issue with Trump that doesn't have any substance behind it. And they're willing to support a Democratic Nazi as long as he's against the Trump agenda. So this is what their former friends in Republican world are saying about them. And now they have the centrist Democratic establishment, who are really their only support system within the Democratic ecosystem, now turning against Plattner. So recently, as of this week, the Bulwark is now trying to kind of play like both sides a little bit, where they're saying, well, maybe Plattner is a liability and all we care about is beating Susan Collins. But at the same time, they can't run away from the fact that they did support him at a certain point and supported him as being Susan Collins's candidate. So they've kind of found themselves in a catch-22. Like currently, like this is ongoing in real time. Like once we get off this, we could check Twitter because there's probably been like a change in the conversation since we started talking, so this is like a current issue that they're having. But it goes back to the point where here you have this candidate with all this baggage, but the attempt to like cripple his campaign was not nearly as volatile as it was to Jasmine Crockett's. And I think they were Janet Mills supporters at one point until Janet Mills just decided she's not making any money and she's stepping back. But again, the Bulwark is trying to toe this line, and I think it's just ideological based on how I've followed them since they begun in 2018, which is they believe that the conversation about race and gender has gone too far and is unfairly alienating a lot of white people who might not have the newest language or newest, perspective on how race and gender are part of American life. But they're not racist, they're not sexist, and they're just a little bit anxious about how the conversation is changing. So I think when you have that perspective, that means that when Jasmine Crockett comes to the scene, you're able to kind of say, okay, this is a little bit much. We've had too much, Black Lives Matters. We've had too much Queer Lives Matters. We've had too much, calling out Islamophobia. we just got to give white people a break right now. So we need the white guy who still believes in all that stuff, but won't remind them of all the racism and sexism and hatred that has been, propagated and popularized over the last 10 to 20 years, going back to even when Obama first became president. So I think that's kind of part of their social conservative ideology, which is that, like, let's not talk about it, even if, like, it's the big elephant in the room. So this is why they support candidates from James Tallarico's Christian moderation to Graham Plattner's open issues but populist edge. It's very clear that there's like kind of a racialized window here. And I will say this: I've tried for the last 10 years of following them, 8 to 10 years of following them, not really subscribing that to them, because I think that's unfair. You never know like what's really going on in people's heads. But I do keep seeing a pattern, which is, unless you come out as kind of like the buttoned up suit and tie minority that's not going to make everyone uncomfortable about like race in America, then you're fine with us. But if you're going to be like Jasmine Crockett and go on CNN and talk about mediocre white boys, then, we're not going to support that, or that's too much. And that's going to alienate voters. Even if, Jasmine Crockett might have, obviously I don't agree with her doing that, to be honest, because I don't think that's like a good communication strategy. I think mediocre is a broad brush because there's mediocre people in every group. But, I think, there is a
good communication strategy. I'm starting to hear these Democratic consultant buzzwords. Are you working part-time on the side here for Democrat?
Well, I mean, from the perspective of like, I can see how that could be alienating to some people who don't come from like a civil rights background or didn't study like, college level American history. But like, at the same time, to just cripple her campaign and to just sap the enthusiasm out of it as a leading voice within the Democratic narrative machine. And also, again, the Bulwark is operating in this liminal space where they aren't corporate media, but they can veil themselves as independent, audience-driven media, but still take like corporate adjacent funding at the same time. So they can kind of be like a sheep in wolf's clothing. They can like say, no, we're not like corporate media. We're not like the New York Times. We're not like CNN. But at the same time, they're still taking money from the Koch brothers. So that's why I've kind of established a new term for them, which is donor-driven media, because there's a lot of donor-driven media on Substack. There's audience-driven media, like you can see at Marlon Weems. He's a great Substacker. He has a very successful audience-driven Substack. Dr. Stacey Patton, she has a very successful audience-driven Substack. Ellie Leonard has a very successful audience-driven Substack. But the Bulwark is more of a donor-driven Substack that says it's an audience-driven Substack, because what they get to hide behind is the fact that they've just pointed out a niche audience within the larger punditry market that they can basically get to cheer them on and say, yeah, I thought Reagan was a good guy too, but Trump is worse. And, not really be comfortable with the conservatism that Trump is revealing, but still say Trump is bad in the process. They found that special audience. And because that special audience is very vocal about who they are, that's what they can say they're being audience driven about. But at the same time, as independent journalists like Ryan Grimm have revealed, they are still taking dollars from corporate or corporate adjacent donors. So, it's that's kind of, that's kind of where I am on the Plattner thing, is I'm just kind of sitting and watching, because the Bulwark currently is in a catch-22 right now, where they have opened themselves up to being criticized by their former Republican colleagues as being hypocrites and supporting a Nazi just because he's against Trump. But they're also now trying to back away a little bit as the Democratic establishment backs away from Plattner. So it's a very interesting development to watch.
Okay, so we're on this next clip will be clip 3, correct? Or did we only play one clip?
Nope, that next one's clip 3. Yep.
All right. So this one is going to be the Mark Cuban turn. All right. Cuban as Democratic standard bearer. He can sit in different rooms. He can sit with Rogan, Theo Vaughn, NBA locker rooms. Let's go ahead and play that clip.
It's similar to mine, except that I'll say this for Mark Cuban, who, again, I'll reserve the right to decide how much I like him. I've watched him medium closely, but I've been paying attention. He's over on Blue Sky.
Yeah, I know. I follow him there.
And he's really doing something over there. Like, and not just, and here's what I like about Mark Cuban. He's trying to be a serious policy person. Mm-hmm. Like, he has done a lot of work on healthcare. He has taken his wealth and his celebrity. He's said, I'm going to try to find innovative solutions on healthcare. And so he's developed like real expertise and also like a real MO. Like, this is the thing that I'm passionate about, that I care about, that I think is going to help Americans.
He's developed an issue set that is right. Deeply important to people, and which, as you and I said yesterday, is an absolute asymmetric advantage because Trump and Republicans cannot answer it.
Yes.
Because their base of voters is opposed to making anybody's life better with healthcare.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think it's strategically a brilliant move. I'm not saying that he's doing it for strategic reasons, but it's
no. The other thing is that I just think that being comfortable on television and in other mediums with video
having everybody know who you are because they remember you
he
from
can
other
walk
mediums.
in. He'll walk in with Joe Rogan and talk to him. He'll walk in with Theo Vaughn. He'll walk in with the Call Your Daddy woman. Like, he clearly can sit in a lot of different rooms.
He can sit in a locker room with NBA players. He can sit with an audience of people who've watched him on TV, right? He can
Shark Tank. Love the business stuff. Yep.
Yeah. And he brings the perceived, well, he's a good businessman.
Yeah.
Right?
That's right. So I just
Cuban
think
AOC 2028.
Grab Alyssa
You think I'm kidding?
I don't.
I'm kidding.
I don't. Okay. Go ahead. Now, you had something. I wanted to hit those two things. I mean, I could talk about the general freezes and how a bunch of morons. Like, I've said this in a couple spaces, but I guess I'll just throw this in here for good measure. If you thought that because they had learned more about the mechanisms of government, Donald Trump in this clown car was going to roll in and demonstrate to people like, oh no, we're ready to govern. Like, that is not what they're doing.
No, they're ready to blow things up. They're ready to destroy things. They're just not ready to govern.
That's right. But in this thing, Jonathan Capehart, who I guess must have been moderating, was one of the people asking questions. She said, like, how many of you think, like, raise your hand if you think that
Is there 4 clips, or is that the last clip that we watched, or did we finish this clip? You know what? I'll go ahead and let it play out.
About the 7%. Yeah.
Kamala Harris didn't win because of sexism and racism, or in part because of sexism and racism. And listen, you and I have discussed this before. I think.
You know what? I'll go ahead and stop it right there. I think that was my mistake. I accidentally pasted together a clip that we already saw right there.
Yeah, that was the first clip. Yep.
All right, so the question I have for you is the problem here that the Bulwark is attracted to room access politics? That person who can sit anywhere and becomes that like fantasy candidate, even if the politics underneath it are unstable?
I think so. And I mean, I think that comes from a tradition of growing up in the Clinton, Bush, Obama era of political campaign making. And Tim Miller writes about this in his book, which again is really interesting in retrospect because he kind of tells on himself, and it kind of becomes like the psychological underpinning of everything the Bulwark produces or puts out. He basically admits that he came of age in the period where people like Steve Schmidt and I forget his name on the top of my tongue, but the Gore staffer who wanted to push for challenging the electoral result in 2000. These people were getting HBO movies made about them. You know, they were kind of becoming superstars for being, you know, a part of this like historic campaign. So there was kind of this Hollywood flair, and other people kind of derogatively call them West Wing nerds. You know, people who kind of like have this very West Wing 90s understanding of American politics. So if you come from that world where at the end of the day, everyone's noble, everyone has a different opinion, but we're all working within this like glamorized institution, then room access politics, just like access journalism, is kind of the baseline for people working in that industry. But that's not really the baseline for people who came of age with the Obama glamour, but then saw him bail out the Wall Street banks, you know, who came of age in the period of time where material well-being was just degraded to the point where people owe hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans because they were preyed upon by private investors just for trying to go to college. You know, all of that room access kind of feels like a theatrical front for something much darker happening backstage. And that is kind of, I think, what, again, undergirds Trump's impact on America, which is that Trump brings the celebrity appeal like Obama had, but in a darker sense where it's more like celebrity deathmatch and less like, Martin Scorsese or Martin Sheen in the West Wing, you know? So it's like, it's more like an inverted, or as I call Trump, he's like the Bizarro of American politics, where he's basically like the inversion of Superman. And so again, you have this, this is kind of where celebrity and access politics has essentially brought us. And for the Bulwark, and Sarah Longwell, who's their founder and their, one of their main brains, talking to the other main brain, which is Jonathan V. Lass, when they support someone like Mark Cuban, because he not only has access to the wealthy, but he also will have access to the manosphere and to the kind of like, broed up, male grievance, genre of communications and entertainment that has kind of risen in the last several years. They look at him and they say, okay, this guy can beat Trump. But then we are in a situation today where Mark Cuban actually allies with Trump because Trump wants to push this whole prescription drug lowering Trump RX agenda. And a lot of people, I think, including Tim Miller on Twitter, were so angry with Mark Cuban and were kind of like cursing him because they were like, how could you legitimize Donald Trump? But at the end of the day, that's the ends of access politics, right? That's the ends of this room access style of political strategy. And if your baseline is that kind of politics, then you're going to get someone like Mark Cuban who, regardless of how you feel about him, he is going to work with the power that be to, as they pointed out, push his policy agenda or his policy belief forward. And so I just felt that clip was really interesting, just kind of to show how this era is so like topsy-turvy, in that in one news cycle, Mark Cuban is the hero of the anti-Trump world. And then the next news cycle, he's the enemy of the anti-Trump world because he's legitimizing Trump, and how that's just not a sustainable model for political analysis or for political prediction markets.
So I want to go ahead and read some comments in the room and acknowledge the people in the chat room and thank you for dropping in. We've got Donna Everett. Thank you for being here. Michelle Yanoy. Thank you for being here. We have Gyro, and Gyro has a comment. It says, I'm so done with equating good businessmen and celebrities with someone that would make the best politician. Have we learned nothing? And then we got Jay Davis in the room. I think she was commenting on one of the clips we saw here earlier. She says she wants a star, but completely rejects Mamdani, their biggest star. Thank you for tuning in, Jay Davis. We got Beth Strand, Joel, LPC, The Good Trouble Journal, Marilyn Carmen, Dajit Kaur, and I'm sure there are others I cannot name. I just ask that you all just hit that, smash that heart button for me, smash that like button, and send that message to the algorithm so this message, this live view, this platform spreads far and wide. Deuce, did you have any comments on what some of those viewers in the chat room said?
I mean, outside of they kind of jive or they kind of vibe with what my central message has been. So it would be interesting if anyone disagrees or feels that it's that we are being too harsh on the Bulwark or that we're picking a fight, an unnecessary fight. I will say that Evan and I in this process have gotten a lot of both huge celebrations where people are saying they've ended their subscriptions or, they no longer take the Bulwark seriously, to people on the other side of the spectrum who are saying, oh, well, why are you picking a fight with an ally when we have Trump as a problem? And so I agree with those comments. But I do just want to kind of answer the why are we picking this fight? Trump already won twice, like the never Trump experiment. And I think this is something that I'm not a huge fan of his, but I pay attention to his writing. Bret Stephens, pretty much after Trump won, he wrote, "This is the end of Never Trump." And I remember that when that happened because JVL came on, and I'll have to go find it in in their archives, but he came on the next level after that, and he just was like angry at Bret Stephens. He's like, how could he say that? But the sad thing is Bret Stephens said that not in a way that I think the diagnosis he had was prescient, but I think his conclusion was prescient, which is that the Never Trump experiment really was built to last under the premise that Trump is an aberration from normal American politics, that 2016 was a fluke, that America, or as David Frum said at one of the conferences I actually attended when I was in grad school and saw him at, America decided to experiment with driving drunk once and almost hit a deer. Let's never do that again. That's how the entire Never Trump foundation is built off of. It's not really meant to last this long, especially in an age where Donald Trump has already committed his most heinous act, which was literally violently attack the government itself. And he still came back from that. And now he is in complete control of the Republican Party, or has at least imprinted upon it in a permanent way that can never be undone. And the Never Trump movement only survives if they can make the fundamental argument that Trump was a one-time flaw and that from Biden forward, we're going to go back to the way things always were or were supposed to go. But Trump winning again, and Trump winning again by under the conditions of the Never Trump strategy being reinforced for the 2024 election, like it was in the 2020 election, has rendered the Never Trump conservative movement useless at this point, because at this point, they are really just trafficking in nostalgia and fantasy rather than living in the reality that Trump has revealed something dark about their former politics or their current politics, and that everything that liberals and progressives have been warning conservatives about since Goldwater, since Reagan, really, when they really started flirting with the neo-Confederates and the pro-segregationists, has come to light under the reign of Donald Trump. So they've been completely delegitimized in their political arguments and their stances and in their strategies. And that is, I think, why the Never Trump era or cycle has passed. And that is why Evan and I have created this podcast, are engaged in this analysis, because if we keep pretending that the Never Trump conservative voices in the pro-democracy tent have potency behind their critiques and their diagnostics, not that we ignore it altogether, but we also look at it with a grain of salt, then we are going to continue making the same mistake that gives us another Trump and gives us a more radicalized Republican Party and gives us the same doom loop that we've been in for the past 10 years, because we're missing something very fundamental that the Never Trump, a narrative about America before and during Trump, intentionally wants to miss, so that it doesn't implicate its own politics or its own fingerprints in creating the media machine that gave us Trump, that made sure that Trump gets away with all of his controversies and all of his criminal acts. That means supporting Fox News when it was in its inception all the way to now. That means saying that Rush Limbaugh isn't as bad as people said he was. That means trying to normalize Pat Buchanan even after he did all the racist speeches in the world. That means ignoring David Duke's elephant in the room and saying that that's only a minority of the party, even though it clearly was more than a minority of the party. All of this stuff led up to the Republican Party being captured by Trump, and they are implicated in it. And the narrative that the Never Trump conservatives want to give us is that they were the good conservatives. They believed in actual philosophical Edmund Burke writings and Bill Buckley writings, even though Bill Buckley was an avid segregationist and wanted to tattoo queer people during the AIDS epidemic. You know, they want to say that we were the intellectual conservatives and we just had really good ideas, but we didn't have any bigotry behind it. That was the idiots down in Appalachia that we just manipulated to win elections. You know, they want to have this narrative, and by us continuing to proliferate and give that narrative any kind of a legitimacy without accountability is holding the pro-democracy conversation back, and it's making sure that the way that Trumpism was able to succeed institutionally will happen again and again and again, because as my mom tells me, as my sister tells me, God will keep making you learn lessons over and over again in a different way until you understand the central lesson that he's trying to teach you.
Right. I like that. I like that saying right there. Listen, this was not about purity, y'all. This was about power. And XVOA, Explicit Voice of America, is not here to ask whether people fighting Trump have clean hands. No. We're here to ask whose hands end up on the machinery when the fight is over. And listen, if this is the kind of political conversation you want more of, subscribe to XVOA on Substack. Anyone listening on YouTube, this is, what we need more of is diagnosis. Okay, this is what you need, and I want you to check out Stew on This from Duece Davis. This is a excellent Substack. Listen, when I'm busy, when I am down on it, when I'm pulling all nighters, and I see this brother's notes or a post come up in the timeline, I stop. Not all the time, but he's one of the ones I will stop, drop what I'm doing, and read his analysis and takes. I may not agree with them all, but I always get something out of it. He always backs it up. Like I try to back up what I say. Even, I'm not saying what I say is right all the time, but I try to back it up with a source. Stu is like that. I think he goes even further sometimes, and his writing is actually kind of entertaining to read. I loved that story about your was that your uncle that you wrote about from Baltimore? The one you told at the beginning of the that was your uncle, right?
A great grandfather.
I'm sorry, your great grandfather.
Yes.
That was just a beautiful story, you know. So tell them where they can find your Substack. Because we were
Thank you.
also talking to people on YouTube.
Oh, lovely. Well, first, thank you for having me and being open to having these discussions. And you've been a really big influence on me as well. And I love your takes on the media and how you basically show how the media is telling a bunch of different stories depending on the media you're subscribing to every week. So I would first say, please subscribe to your Substack and to your page and your YouTube. But I can be found at stewonthis.com. I am on YouTube under Steward Beckham. I'm trying to get more of my videos on there. I'm also on TikTok. I'm trying to get back on TikTok. I like to write. It's a little bit harder for me to do video, but I got to get in the groove a little bit more. I'm a teacher.
A little bit harder to do video. Oh my God, this is a whole completely different game we're talking about here.
Yeah, no, it is. It is. But I'm a teacher. I teach history in grade school. So sorry, we're putting food away in the background, so if you hear a little bit of feedback, but I teach history to middle schoolers, so I'm learning how to speak and how to share ideas, especially for people who are not really trying to be in school. It's actually hilarious. But that's where you can find me. stewonthis.com, YouTube, my name, Steward Beckham. Duece Davis is my pseudonym. It's my pen name. I changed it recently because Steward Beckham has so many hats in the real world, whether it's with my fraternity or with my family or with my profession. You know, it's like I have to be a lot of different things. So Duece Davis is kind of where I'm able to just be my political id, the person who's thinking about politics, whether, you know, someone likes it that day or not. So when you're reading me, you're reading my alter ego, Duece Davis. And so that's why I changed the pen name. There's a long history of pen names going from basic reasons of just creative inspiration to just personal safety. So, yeah, so that's where you can find me. And I'm really, really glad we can talk about this and have me on this show.
All right. Thank you, Duece. Hey, before we're going to land this thing, but I just want to read the comments one more time and give
let's do it.
Shout out and thank you to all these people who joined us here. Donna Everett said, mutual admiration. Love it. That is cool. A history teacher. All right. You got you an admirer right here. Gyro, thank goodness that someone like you is teaching history. Billy says, thank you both. Appreciate analysis and discussion. Gilda Johnson says, excellent discussion. I will check out your, I think she's talking about your platform right there. And Zelda Zulu, thank you. Jeff, Gyro, Donna. See, Donna Everett says, they are not warriors for change and things we want. No Jim Crow, no ICE, no genocide, healthcare for all, tax billionaires. M. Hope says, thank you. More people need to see reality. And Donna again says, see, what does she say? That is absolute truth, Deuce. Thank you both. We'll go ahead and end on that note. We need to do this again, man. We need to do this more often.
I'm here. I'm gonna start doing a little bit more. I'm talking with Moms Have No Party Substack next week, and another Substacker, Natasha K. And then you can find Evan and I on our Reality Check the Bulwark series. But we're also kind of phasing out of that, and we're gonna start doing a democracy draft where we just kind of highlight the people who are doing good work for democracy. So I will be around. Just, you got my number, you got my you know where to find me. So whenever you want to just talk about anything from, what's going on in the world to just fun conversation about pop culture or sports, I like talking about all of it.
All right. So on that note, everybody, you have a good and safe weekend. And that is a wrap.
All right. Have a good weekend, guys.
All right,
Thank
you too, man.